So, just a quick introduction to HDK. We are a digital agency that provides website, marketing, and design services to arts and cultural organizations like yourselves. Our clients includes Art Council England, Stowe House, and Birmingham Royal Ballet. To give you guys a heads up, captions are available. So, and we are recording this session and we will share this with you in around a week. So don't worry too much if you miss anything. There will always be time for you to catch up. At the end of the session, we have a dedicated Q&A session. So please feel free to ask any questions in the comment, in the chat, and we will return to them in the Q&A sessions. If you think you know the answer to the questions, feel free to answer them. We love having an open discussion and sharing thoughts and having inspiring moments between the panelists, but also with the attendees as well. Quick introduction to myself. I am Kay Pang. I am the host of this webinar. I am digital project manager. I use she, her pronouns. Um, I am a woman in her early 30s with black short hair, and I'm wearing pink and blue striped shirts, and I have a nice little nose ring on my nose.
And I'm Bella. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman in my late 20s with brown, slightly wavy hair. And I've got little earrings on today. And I'm part of the digital marketing services team at HDK. I'll pass over to Tor.
Hi everyone, I'm Victoria. My pronouns are she, her. I'm HGK's web support coordinator. And just a quick visual description. I'm a white woman in my mid-20s. I have long brown curly hair and a fringe, and today I'm wearing a white t-shirt.
So the agenda for today's session, first we will be discussing how to find your organizational voice, and then we'll move on to discuss how you can bring your voice to life. And then we will sort of explain how you can speak your brand voice to your audiences and wrap it up nicely with a Q&A session. If you do want to share our webinar in social media, please feel free to use our hashtag HDKWebinar. It's a nice way for us to keep track on what kind of comments we get on this webinar. And yeah, without further ado, I will hand it over to Bella, our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm going to be jumping right in by talking about how you go about finding your brand voice. And I'm really excited to be talking about brand voice today. I think it is such an important part of your brand identity, but can sometimes get neglected in favor of other maybe more visible parts of your identity. And I love to play with words. I'm sure as many of us do, we feel quite creative as arts marketing professionals. So this is definitely a chance to start exploring your voice and be a little bit more creative with that. But to start off with, why are we talking about voice today? Why is it important? There's a couple of reasons, and it all culminates together. One of them is that it's a core part of that brand identity as some of your parts in your ecosystem, in your brand, which can include things like your design and your messaging, your broader marketing strategy, and also the activities that you do day to day. Your voice allows you to differentiate yourself from other organizations that might be doing similar things to you, and brings that emotional connection to the forefront with your audience, all of which can be really beneficial because, as we know, we live in such a crowded digital landscape where you're always competing for attention on social media or visibility in someone's inbox, and also someone else's plans this weekend. Someone's other plans that your voice can help your audience get excited about what you're doing. So I wanted to start off by asking how confident everyone here feels about their brand voice and why you've come today. So I'm just going to set up a little poll, and if everyone wouldn't mind saying whether they feel actually very confident and they're maybe just here for a bit of a refresher, or they haven't even started thinking about their brand guidelines or their voice. Really useful for us to see that as we go through. Some come through on the lower end there, so a bit unconfident. A few people who are very confident actually and quite confident. They just maybe you're just here for a bit of a refresher. That's great. But I think people are saying here, maybe they want a bit of a refresh on how they can apply their voice in their digital marketing, and that's really great. That's what we're here for today, is to talk through some ideas on bringing your voice to life and really applying it. So thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts there. And getting straight into it, how do we think about finding voice? Who are you as an organization, and what makes a voice part of your organization? In some ways, I like to think of brands a bit like people, and to start figuring out how you speak, how you express yourself, you need to think a bit about your personality and your identity. And you can think about how someone who's quite optimistic and playful might tell a story with a bit more humor, a bit of lightness, maybe some exaggerating, whereas someone who's more analytical or a bit more serious might focus on facts and be very measured and precise. So your personality affects the way that you come across and that you express yourself. And there's three elements that I like to think of when we're starting off thinking about voice. The first is your identity, which is maybe the facts about you, about your organization, the hows, the whats, whys, and whens. And then you've got your personality, which is more about your traits or your behaviors as an organization. Finally, you have the expression that comes out of that and how you express yourself through your words and your voice. And starting off with identity, I think this is really important because your brand isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's how you present yourself in the day-to-day as well as through your online activities. So it is really that foundation that builds the groundwork, it's the building blocks of your voice. So what you can do to potentially start thinking about your identity is think about your context, your background, and your history, where you're based, what you do, like your activities, your events and products, and why you exist, your reason for being, what is your purpose and your mission and your values. And just a quick note here is that we will be sharing a handout towards the end of the session. So don't stress about taking too many notes, or we'll give some exercises and prompts that you can do in your own time, as well as being able to look back at the recording. So I've thought a bit about an example that we could say here as an identity. And I've imagined an independent art gallery. Now, our office at HDK is based in East London, so I'm imagining they're close by to us, and maybe they were founded in the 1980s, and they showcase regular exhibitions of contemporary art, as well as hosting some artist talks and residencies, and bring in the local community to make the work accessible, and they really care about their community. Their mission and their vision is that they exist to support underrepresented voices, and provide a platform for challenging and provocative art. And they really want to make experimental art accessible to a broad audience. So how do we then start thinking about what that identity is and how it translates into a personality? And personality, I like to think of in two areas. One is your positioning, which is all about how you differentiate yourself from other organizations. It's why someone might choose you over going to someone else, and why your audiences engage with you specifically. And that ties into the emotional connection that an audience might have with you. So how do you want your audience or your users to feel after interacting with you? What's your short-term and your longer-term legacy? And maybe even think about, if your brand was a person, how might they be described? And there's a number of ways you can start thinking about this, perhaps look back at some audience research if you've done that before. Even post-event questionnaires can be really helpful to understand why an audience member might have come to see you today. And so your positioning is a really core part of how you start thinking about presenting yourself and your personality. And let's go back and take that example that I was talking about before, the imaginary art gallery. They do really want to differentiate themselves from other contemporary art galleries that maybe might feel in people's minds a bit elitist or exclusive. They want to feel very colourful and very accessible and quite welcoming, and they want to make sure that everyone is able to understand what they do. They want people to feel quite stimulated with an energy and ideas after interacting with them, and feel maybe like they have some assumptions challenged. So, how do we convey all of that as a character? And I like to get really specific about, let's actually imagine a character for this. So even sketching one out on a bit of paper would be can be really helpful. For me, this imaginary character is wearing bright, colourful clothing, and they have a wide network of friends that they like introducing to each other when they find commonalities and common links. They feel that their purpose in life is really to improve the world and to help other people do the same thing by changing people's minds and opinions. But they aren't shy about sharing their opinion. They're quite uncompromising, even if it makes people a bit uncomfortable. So how might we then turn that imaginary personality, that imaginary persona, into a voice? And this is where you might want to start thinking about, if that character was speaking, how might they speak with someone else? And this is why I think building out a character profile is really helpful, because it can really bring that to life. So you can ask yourself questions like, if this was a real person, where might they typically be found? Would they be at a fancy dinner party, or on a walk in a park? Who might they be talking to when they're there? What would they be talking about? And how would they be explaining their story if they're telling a story? In what ways? So thinking on the character that I've invented here, I'm imagining that they're actually hosting something like a zine making workshop. They're not at a exhibition opening, they're not standing on stage at a conference, they're doing something communal and collaborative. They might be quite loud and colourful and go on some tangents of stories. I think they're a little bit larger than life, but all in the aim of being very welcoming and inviting to people. They maybe exaggerate some stories, but they're always optimistic about people's work and why they're there. But they don't try to be very cheeky or silly, and they take themselves really seriously when they feel it's needed. So some voice elements for this character, just starting to think of some adjectives, potentially energetic, maybe something like storyteller, or they're vivid, they're quite charismatic, and they're authentic and they're bold. And just a note here is, when you're thinking about voice, try to avoid more generic attributes. I think it's easy to land on things like, we're professional, we're honest, we're open, we're friendly. Those are all things that I expect a majority of organizations might want to be to their audience. So if you don't feel it's a differentiating factor or a personality trait that you might see in a friend potentially, it might just be more of a general guideline that you want to keep in mind rather than that voice trait. So I'd like to get everyone thinking a little bit about what different voices might look like. So I've picked out some examples of organizations I feel do this really well in the arts sector. One of these being the Crab Museum, and I'm sure a lot of us will have seen the great social media posts that the Crab Museum does. They have a very eccentric and quite absurd voice, which comes across in their content as well. And there's two things I find really interesting about the Crab Museum and their voice. One is that they have a really huge digital following, and you can see even on the screenshot here of their social media post, their voice has allowed them to attract a huge and engaged online audience. So this is a bit of a case study in how voice can really affect your digital following and your growth and your engagement with audiences. I was actually lucky enough to recently visit them in Margate in their tiny little museum. And I was really struck by how their voice isn't just on social media, it is throughout their website, their printed materials, their museum texts, and that it all stems from a purpose, which is to interrogate what museums are and what they tell us. And so their voice, they describe things in quite a humorous way, to get that point across. So, don't just create your voice out of thin air. Really think about why you're saying things in a certain way. But I know that we can't all have quite the same personality as the Crab Museum. So one other organisation that I really like is Facts Liverpool. And I think this is a great example because it shows how small copy tweaks can affect the way that your voice comes across to your audience and your personality and your identity. So they're quite dynamic and they're quite innovative in the way that they write. So some quotes here from the screenshots I have are they nurture the next generation of voices and visionaries. They're not just nurturing or showcasing the next generation of artists. They're saying specifically voices and visionaries. Things like vibrant program, making sense of the world today, transformative experiences. It's a world of possibilities that enriches people's lives. So think about how small word choices might affect your voice and how it comes across to your audience. And just to finish off this section on how you find your voice and some examples here. I think it's sometimes tricky to feel like we can really have a strong personality when we do a similar thing to what others might do in the sector. But I wanted to share some examples of Glastonbury stages, which, of course, in our minds might be quite similar because they're all at the same festival. They all do a similar thing, which is show music on stage. But you can see, I hope, in some examples that I'm about to show how different voices can be when you put your personality into it. And so this one is Silver Haze. Their voice is very political and progressive. They talk about optimism is still a political act. In a seemingly ever more chaotic and divided world, a better future is still possible, combining forward-thinking electronic music artists with positive action. And compare this to Greenfields, where they are calling all fairies and dreamers and believers to create a tapestry of magical experiences and let your heart be open and play a part in building a better world. It's very compassionate and magical and quite virtuous. And the final example I'm going to show here is San Remo, which is told like a story, like a poem almost. It's very dramatic. What does it mean to dance in the moment of forever? Before we go, we can find ourselves in something greater, the flickering neon of the San Remo. So just seeing how these bits of text show such different personalities is really interesting. And I want to ask, just to round up this section, if everyone could think for maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds, jot down some notes on a page, what do you think are 3 adjectives that might sum up your brand voice, whether it's your voice as it is now or what your ideal, what you might want it to be? And I think it could be really helpful for others to see what other people in the sector are using as their voices or some personality adjectives. So I'll just leave 20 or so seconds for people to start thinking on that and adding their ideas. Yeah, see some coming in here. Bold, cheeky, warm, engaging, creative, forward-thinking, gently uncompromising. Really liking these. I love that you can immediately start to flesh out a personality based on just a few adjectives. Brilliant. And I'll let, if you haven't put your thoughts in the chat already, keep doing so. I'm going to start moving on to the next section, but do keep adding your thoughts and what your adjectives are into the chat. Because once you've got your voice and you've thought of your adjectives, you've got your personality in mind, how do you then start to apply it across, your comms and your marketing, your content? And I see that from the poll that we shared earlier on, a few of you are, maybe your voice theoretically, but you're not quite sure how to start sharing that with your audience and engaging your audience through your voice and how to apply it across your comms. And I'm loving seeing all these other comments coming through. Inclusive, community-focused, bold, inspiring, creative, inclusive, nurturing, collaborative, accessible, approachable, accessible, creative. I see some similarities here, and I think that is related to who we are as a sector. We are wanting to be creative, wanting to be optimistic, and very approachable and accessible. So I think what might be helpful in this session is to start thinking about ways that you can maybe differentiate yourselves more from peers or what others might be doing. But bringing it to life, it can be, I think this is where a lot of organizations start to trip up, is that they've thought of their personality and their voice, but maybe there's no action plan to carry it forward, or maybe one person owns it and they leave after a few years and actually no one's quite sure of the voice. But before I start talking about things like guidelines and review checklists, I want to talk about how there's two things that are slightly different that people might use interchangeably sometimes, which is voice and tone of voice. And I think it's often more useful to think of them as two separate elements. Voice is that sort of constant and slightly flexible expression of your brand personality, and tone of voice is the way that you adapt your voice depending on the situation and the tone that's needed. So let's look at it a bit like this. Your voice is filtered by a context or a situation that you're talking in. So imagine that you're catching up with a friend over coffee versus delivering a presentation to your boss. The way that you'll speak will change depending on the context of that conversation, your relationship with the person, and the motivation for the conversation. And placing this in the context of your marketing activities as arts marketing organizations, you might have your voice in mind already, and then that's going to be filtered out by where you're communicating. So which channel are you using, when, what time, and which platform you're using. Which audience are you speaking to? Is it loyal members or is it a completely new audience in an ad campaign? And for what purpose? What's the motivation? What's the call to action? What are you hoping people will do after reading this message? All of which will, of course, then affect your content and your copy across all of your marketing activities. So let's think back to that example that I was talking about with the independent art gallery and the welcoming, vibrant zine maker as a persona. And I've pulled out some voice elements that I think we could start playing around with as our brand voice for this art gallery. They're a vivid storyteller. This persona, they love to tell stories and they sometimes exaggerate a little bit, but that's what they love to do. They're bold and authentic. They're not afraid to show their colors and to be vibrant and to be themselves. And they also have an element of grounded optimism. They bring positivity, they bring a welcoming energy into any space that they're in. And I won't go through these in detail, but these are some examples of how your tone elements or your voice elements might shift in tone depending on where you're using them and when. So this storyteller element, let's say it's really helpful for social media and for video content and maybe even your newsletter. You're writing long form copy that's really story based and telling the stories of your artists and your exhibitions and your makers, and in a way that will really engage and create new understandings with your audience and build a kind of a sense of intrigue and an emotional connection. But it might not be so helpful as a voice element for ads and campaigns and booking copy or booking journeys, anything that needs just information shared quickly and something a bit punchier. But then next on the list, we've got bold and authentic, which might be shown through more confident terms or verbs, and things like challenge or reimagine or interrupt. So you might want to dial that up for marketing campaigns and digital ads and those booking journeys or event pages that I was talking about, but let's maybe dial it down a little bit for more sensitive messaging. And you want it to kind of persuade people. Persuade your audience and be invigorating and be that sense of passion. And then with grounded optimism, that might be shown through a language of hope and possibility and a bit of an emphasis on change making as your core mission. So it's great for website copy and maybe to engage your audiences with your mission across other channels, but maybe not so much for ads and campaigns, and maybe not so much for that punchy messaging that we were talking about. And just looking back and remembering that this organization's mission was to support underrepresented voices, which they can do by telling stories. And they want to provide a platform for challenging work. And so they do that by challenging and provoking through those bold statements, but also making experimental art accessible. So they do this by being quite welcoming and inviting and optimistic. So your voice can absolutely and should absolutely tie into your mission and why you do what you do. And now you've got your voice and you've started thinking about the different tones that you can apply. Um, just like you have a brand toolkit where you see where to put your different logos and what colors to use and when to use them and how you format a document, maybe you should probably have a voice toolkit. This will make it so much easier for you to not only draft copy, but also review other people's copy, make sure it's consistent across your channels, and just future-proof that voice so you haven't done all that work and then again it gets wasted down the line if it gets forgotten or left alone for a while. And there's two parts to these guidelines, two important elements. One is that it's part creative inspiration, part around, why you use this voice and what you're saying and how you're saying it. But also partly about editorial guidelines. And so, rules and guides on headlines or specific wording. So maybe think of it a bit like you're on stage, you're playing a character in a theatre, and your brand and your brand persona is the character, but the guidelines are your script and your stage directions. And here are some of the building blocks. And again, this will be in the handout that we share later on, so don't worry about writing too many notes down, but just a bit of an initial guideline. There are also a lot of examples you can find online, so don't be shy to just type into Google specific brand and then voice or tone of voice and see what it comes up with. So the building blocks of your brand voice guidelines, and this could be called anything from writing guidelines or writing principles or tone of voice guide or tone of voice kit, anything that works for you. You want to start with why voice matters for you, and your philosophy of it, and maybe even the journey that you've taken to arrive at this voice and the importance of that voice and engaging with your audiences. You've then got the voice attributes, those 3, maybe 4 voice traits that we developed earlier, expressed as those writing principles. We've then got some tone guidance, where you use that tone and when you dial it up and when you dial it down. Some do's and don'ts. Don't be shy to write specific phrasing and say, this is what we do say. Don't say it like that, because that, and relate these to the specific voice attributes that we're speaking about. And then finally, the editorial style and the practical tools that you might want to use as a team. So things like key phrases, words to avoid, maybe even your sign-offs and your review checklists. Potentially some AI guidelines in there about how, if you do use AI, how you use it. Things like accessibility, inclusivity, grammar, punctuation, all of that can go in there. And I just want to really quickly show what I think is a great example of some brand voice guidelines, which is Monzo. And some of us might have come across this before. It's quite well known in kind of the brand voice landscape. Because it's so clear and it's publicly accessible as well. So I'm going to pop the link in the chat because I think it's just a great example to look on and take inspiration from. Just giving 1 second to pop that in. There we go. And obviously Monzo have quite a different voice to most banks. It's quite humorous, it's quite simple, it's inviting. And I actually use Monzo as a digital bank, so it's really interesting that you can see their voice applied across all of their digital touch points, which Tora is going to touch on in a little bit of time. So their principles here on screen, if you can't see, they say the key voice attributes are straightforward kindness and everyday magic and warm wit. And then what they do is they describe the different areas that you might find their communications, their marketing, their activities, and how the different elements of those voice play into that, how they might write. So this is on campaigns. They say that they're our biggest personality moments. They want to stand out as much as possible. And so all those traits are really on max. They're all high, the kindness, the magic, and the wit, because they want to feel like, they're expressing the fullest of their personality to reach a really broad audience. Whereas in their customer service, they know that wit and magic are maybe not the right tone to take because people might be dealing with some sensitive or difficult situations, but they want to be kind and they want to be clear. So they've still got their voice there. They're still maintaining their trait, their personality, but they're just understanding how they adjust that. And so they say customer service often means dealing with sensitive or difficult situations. The risk of getting it wrong is greater than the benefit of getting it right when it comes to the wit and the magic. And to sum up why guidelines are important, I think there's three key things. It's that it avoids these inconsistencies in copy. It really helps you to be consistent and make that clear to yourself and your team over time. It avoids your voice changing direction as well over time as people change role or maybe even leave the organization. Having something consistent and set in stone that you're able to look back on in the future is really handy. And can also save time that might be lost writing multiple drafts or disagreements on phrasing or having multiple rounds of reviews to do small things like formatting changes. And maybe it might help you to be more creative under some constraints rather than just facing a blank slate on a page. Just really quickly touching on AI. Obviously, I'm sure many of us will have used some AI in terms of writing copy over the last year and a half. And I'm sure a lot of us will also know that you can start to tell those telltale signs of AI writing. AI is a predictive tool. It's great for saving time, but essentially it's not very original, it's not very creative, and it really only understands that superficial level of what humans might think is interesting or engaging writing. So absolutely use it for things like, giving prompts on developing your own brand voice, your copy, analyzing other people's voices and finding inspiration from that, or maybe even feed in your fully developed brand guidelines into it and ask it to review your copy based on the brand guidelines. Does it match? Is there anything that you're missing? But I'd say don't use it for developing your full personality and your full guidelines. That has to be something that's a bit creative and original and coming from you and your team as custodians almost of that brand. And you understand it a lot better than your brand and what your organization does, a lot better than AI will. Also, don't let it write copy without any form of human intervention. Whether it's maybe you write the first draft and then AI can review it again against those brand guidelines, the voice guidelines. And also, you could do it the other way around. You could let AI draft a first statement or a first bit of text and then make sure that you adjust it into your own voice. But don't let it just handle it all by itself. And especially don't let it write sensitive copy, anything that might need some cultural sensitivity, for example, or lived experience. And a quick note on then how you can make those guidelines stick, just making sure that you keep them accessible, you put them in your team folders, maybe make some short summaries for people to look at instead of having to trawl through a long document. Build them into processes in your editorial checklists or your review stages. Make sure you train the team when they're ready, and maybe revisit them something like once a year, every year and a half, to look back and just make sure, is this still working for us? Is there anything that we've learned over the last year to implement? And also just keep that fresh in your head of why you're using a specific tone of voice. So a couple more examples just before I pass over to Tor of how organizations might apply their voice differently across different channels. Here we've got the young Vic. They've got quite a youthful and playful voice on social media. You can see here on the social media screenshot that I've got little stories round up for a weekend treat in a meme format on the post. Whereas on their website, they might bring out that inviting, that inclusive tone more, talking about everyone belongs here, prioritizing kindness, being accountable. And I love Christie's tone of voice. I wanted to show a voice that was a little bit more traditional, maybe in the art space. But I think one of their core parts of their voice in the digital landscape is storytelling. So you could see in the screenshot here on social media, they talk about the Royal Academy's summer exhibition is the respectable elder, new contemporary is its rebellious younger sibling. They've got some puns in a blog about the how tennis is sometimes portrayed in art and objects. So looking back at SIT 15 standout objects that have aced the auction block, so they've got a little bit of playfulness in there. Whereas when they're talking to quite a niche audience in terms of people who want to sell with Christie's, of course they're bringing out that authoritative tone of voice more. They've got unrivaled art market expertise, leave the rest to us. So these are some examples of how you can play around with your tone. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Tor to talk us through how you might be able to bring this out in your digital touchpoints.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, I wanted to touch on speaking to an audience, but from a UX UI perspective. So looking at our website and our digital experiences and seeing how we can track that through from the user persona to the user journey. So we know that brands are like people, and our voice flexes depending on who we're speaking to. So of course, before we think about copy or design, we need to think about who our audience is and then tailor the UX and UI to their experience. And earlier Bella was talking about maybe sketching out a character that best represents your brand. So then we next need to think about the people who might interact with that character, your users, and how personas can help us to do that. So user personas are really useful. They're basically semi-fictional representations of users based on real research and data. And they include things like goals, pain points, behaviors, both digital and non. They go beyond demographic information, so they're not just age or job titles, but they include information about the user, such as, are they a first-time user or visitor to your website? Are they a funder? Maybe they're a theatre goer. All of these people will interact differently with your digital experience, so understanding this will help us to map it in the best way we can for them. I've put together a persona for a user and I've created a hypothetical example so we can look at how centering the user experience helps us create and audit our tone to flex and touch on the things that they need, want, and potentially find frustrating. But before I do this, I just wanted to talk about something that helped me to create this hypothetical example. So I recently went on a trip with my sister around Portugal. And one of our favourite things to do when we travel together is secondhand shopping. So naturally, whilst we were there, we thrift hopped to the various Humana stores, and they're absolutely everywhere. And I would highly recommend going if you're in Portugal. And while we were there, she made an observation that I felt aligned with the topic of today's webinar. And what's missing is that same sense of community and excitement that you see in these TikTok thrifting hauls that would create a really fun networking opportunity for designers and thrifters alike. So this got me thinking how this applies in the context of arts, culture and heritage. So I created a hypothetical museum to illustrate it. I called it the Museum of Thrifting. And basically it's built around her desires for community spaces, design networking, and inspiration from sustainability and fashion culture. So I've put together this user persona, and I won't go through everything, but you'll be able to see, you'll be able to have a look through when we share the webinar with you. So this is Bex, a 32-year-old shoe and accessories designer. She's motivated by sustainability, networking, and inspiration, but she struggles to find engaging events outside of social media. Digitally, she needs clear event info, easy ways to connect with other like-minded fashion individuals, and inspiring content. And so this persona gives us a lens for shaping the tone towards Bex. So I'll talk through some of the things that would be useful to include in a persona. So of course you've got the demographics. So Bex is a 32-year-old woman living in London, and for work she's a shoe and accessories designer. It then goes on to talk roughly about her background and her interests. In this case, she studied fashion accessory design. She's interested in arts and culture, live music performances, socializing, and solo trips around London, experiencing arts and culture. You then want to talk about the goals and motivations of the user. So in this case, Bex's goals and motivations are to network with like-minded sustainability and fashion communities, learn about sustainable design, exhibitions and panel talks, and then participate potentially in second-hand clothing swaps. So to find new pieces, both for fun and for upcycling for inspiration for designs. You then want to talk about the pain points. So does your user struggle to find information about events? In this case, Bex is struggling to find information about events that make secondhand exciting and current, like on TikTok. She finds it hard to find ways to connect with fashion communities outside of work, and finds it challenging to find relevant opportunities for interactivity outside of social media. And then you want to touch on what's important in a digital sense. So what does she feel she needs? She feels she needs clear info on events. So what's free versus paid, easy ways to connect with other people, and access to inspiring content. So obviously these are great for, this is a small example, but if in the context of organisational planning, you'd need to conduct a form of interviews or research, analyse it and then funnel it into a persona. Same for the brand voice of this museum, it's simply to outline the touch points that you should look for when deciding on your tone of voice, which we'll look into shortly. But before you do this, you'll want to start by thinking about key moments you want to map and the user's journey steps. So I've created a user journey table in Figma, and you can either do this digitally or really low fidelity, just sketch it out with pen and paper. So we've got this user statement. Bex wants to attend fun, informative events that encourage networking. So basically what we're doing is we're taking phrases, words from the user persona we've already created and putting them into this journey that we can map out later on. And there's kind of four main pillars to think about when you're looking at a user journey table. And you want to think about the awareness. So in this case, she sees a TikTok haul, and she's then decided that she wants to find events that relate to it. In consideration, she finds the website, she clicks into the Museum of Thrifting website and then starts looking for events on the events pages. She makes a decision, so basically she's decided she wants to book an event that she's interested in. And then retention, so what does she do after the event? She may recommend the event to friends and colleagues. And thinking in stages just helps us design the content and make it right for each step. So after you've done this, you can then put together a digital touch points map. And again, you can sketch this out, but I've just whipped out one in Figma for now. So you can see that we've got TikTok. So she's looked at the TikTok haul, she's gone to the website. And then maybe the next most important thing is that she goes to the events page. to see what she's interested in. And you've got the newsletter here, and potentially this could be a point for retention. You want her to sign up to the newsletter, but it may not be as important as her actually booking onto an event. But it's still important to include it in the touchpoint map. And then from here, you want to go to retention. So maybe you want Bex to become a member. So then this goes on to tone mapping, because by grounding your user in a persona, you can then start to map out the content and the copy that you actually want to include across those digital touchpoints. And it's basically a strategic tool that helps UX writers to choose the correct tone for their contexts. And we can use it to audit copy, as well as working with the team, like developers and designers, to create user interface elements like buttons or calls to action. So this is a tone mapping quadrant, and basically it's 4 sections that you can use to decide where you want to put your copy, decide which sections of the website should be in each. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples for each of those. So we've got first, concise and fun. So basically this could be for UI elements like empty states or notifications. And empty states are essentially copy that a user sees when there's maybe a moment on the website where there's nothing to display or there's no action needed. This could be something like a 404 page. So in this example, we've got 404, this page is out thrifting, let's get you back on track. What it does is it playfully continues the journey to turn a moment of frustration into a continuation for the user, so they can go back to looking at content that they might be interested in. And it gives clear redirection without over-explaining. And then we've got fun and detailed in the next segment. So typically this would be used for bigger bodies of text. So for landing pages, for onboarding. So when a user first lands on the website and they want to know what you're all about. So the example here is for the Museum of Thrifting. Museum of Thrifting, bringing secondhand to the forefront. Here, fashion lovers, thrifters, and professional designers come together to swap, share, and celebrate thrifting. Explore our talks on sustainable design, discover statement pieces in our clothing swap events, etc. So you're basically just having fun with it and explaining what you're about. It works because it sets the scene, it tells people what you're about, it's inviting, it has community-based language, and it helps new visitors to understand your value straight away. And then we've got detailed and serious. So this is for things like booking issues. So you want to be reassuring in this moment. This could be a moment like your booking could not be submitted because some required information is missing. You just want to be able to list out what the user needs to do to get back on track. And then finally, we have serious and concise. And in the context of the Museum of Thrifting, this could be an event. So basically, your spot for the vintage clothing swap on the 12th of September is confirmed. It's simple, it's straightforward, it confirms that the user has made a booking, and it's reassuring. I would suggest for that to kind of just get a big sheet of A3 paper with your team, draw out the quadrants, think about your copy, your UI elements and tone across the different stages, and this will just help you and your team to be aligned and stay consistent. So yeah, so then we just want to just touch on why voice is important. Obviously, we've got your identity. Your brand voice is the personality behind your words. It gives your organisation a clear identity that people will recognise. Strong brand, consistency and tone builds strength. Emotional connection, the right voice makes people feel something that they can connect with. Audience relationship, your brand personality will change how you have conversations about your content and shape who joins your community. And then differentiation. You want to sound like yourself and not like somebody else. I think that's everything. I'm going to pass back to Kay now.
We do have a handout. The link is just shared by Bella over there at the top as well. Yeah, this is a nice little handout so that you can take away after the webinar so that it gives you a little prompts and activities to develop and improve your existing or non-existing brand guidelines. And with that, we are going to close the session today. Just a final thank you to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining.